Hello comrades, welcome to another Polish Tom stream. My name is Vasily and today I will be accompanied by Comrade Thomas.
Hello again.
Tomorrow, June 22nd, will be the anniversary of the German attack on the Soviet Union. 84 years ago, on Sunday, for millions of Soviet people, life was divided into before and after. The Great Patriotic War of the Soviet people against the German fascist invaders began, taking the lives of tens of millions of people. Nowadays, the image of this war is significantly distorted. Bourgeois historians and politicians repeatedly claim that this war was a war between two identical totalitarian dictators, that Stalin blindly believed the Germans, that the USSR was completely unprepared for war, or that the Soviet people won in spite of Stalin and the leadership of the Soviet Union. Today we will watch fragments from a video from the Armchair Historian YouTube channel, where a lot of time is devoted to the preparation for war and its initial stage. The channel has almost 2.5 million subscribers, and the video we're looking at has reached about 1.2 million views. Like and subscribe and support us using the links below. You can send your questions on our PayPal by using this email that is provided on the screen, and you can support us on Patreon. Well, I think we will be starting. So to explain how we will arrange this, we have some timestamps. Mostly we will be going through the video, listening to a specific part and stopping to discuss it, though we won't be covering the entire video, mostly dedicating our time to covering the part about preparations for war again and initial stage, and then we'll be switching right to the end.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. The strategy of the Red Army during the Second World War is one of the most analyzed, yet misrepresented topics in history. Films and games often portray the Soviets mindlessly throwing themselves against their enemies, and ordered to be shot by their own officers if the men refused orders. These myths were primarily perpetuated by German officers seeking to slander their enemies, and in this video, we'll analyze both the highs and lows of Joseph Stalin's war effort, how he both helped and hindered his nation, and how his commanders performed under his leadership, if they weren't already dismissed.
So, Thomas, would you like to say something about the beginning of this video?
Well, I'm almost impressed by his, understanding that some of these myths come directly from the World War II period, from the German side, but then he just dives right in and starts to embrace them. So it's a little peculiar. And then in the background, you can see the kind of imagery and drawings he's using for his visual element kind of show you what he's going to do. And already, even though he says he's going to present you a balanced view, it's pretty clear, what he's going to be presenting us with and the kind of material. I think the viewer can already get kind of where he's going with this.
I agree. This narrative about executed generals, about repressed generals, is going to be one of the key narratives in the entire video. So after that, he gives some time for advertisements, so we will be moving to the actual part. Let me see.
Victorious, but went on to become a global superpower. To explain how the Soviets could simultaneously suffer such losses, yet still somehow be on the winning side, we will first explore its leadership, then move down the chain of command to see how individual war strategies were implemented. All power within the USSR was centralized around a single figure, Joseph Stalin. Not a single decision was made without Stalin's approval, either directly or indirectly.
So
Right off the bat, yeah, doesn't this seem a little childish, this portrayal of the central single figure? How much time did Stalin have in his day to be involved in every single... He says not a single decision was made. I mean, he wants to be a serious historian and speak in that manner, but then he says kind of silly things like that.
sure, this traditional label, Stalin the dictator, Stalin is basically the center of universe in the USSR, etc., etc. Though in reality, it simply was not like that. Stalin was not a dictator in the means that he, usually dictators are those who sneaked into power with unlawful means, like illegally. And if we take Stalin, we cannot say so. Firstly, he was elected as the general secretary of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks at the CPSU congresses in the party. It was done repeatedly since 1920s, and this is only about the party. If we speak about the Soviet government, he was also a Soviet deputy. He was literally elected in the Soviets. And throughout his leadership, he was elected from one of the districts of Moscow. So, yeah, in both the Communist Party and the Soviet government, Stalin was elected democratically. And finally, when we speak about this narrative of Stalin being dictator, we have to keep in mind that this false portrayal overshadows the rest of the people, the rest of the leaders. Right from the start, we can name such figures as Molotov, Kalinin, Kaganovich. These were prominent members of the Soviet government, of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and all of them played significant part in governing the country, and all of them actually started with Lenin. So if we speak about leadership, we simply cannot say that, as Armchair Historian says, all power within the USSR was centralized around a single figure, Joseph Stalin.
And I think it's pretty clear why he's saying that. He's used that word, right? Centralized. All power was centralized under Stalin. It's kind of a liberal's view of what socialist centralization is like. They hear that word and they go, oh, one man, right? Essentially, but really that's kind of a almost childish understanding of the idea of state centralization, or the idea that the state is playing a central and leading role in society. That they hear that and they go, "Oh my God, Joseph Stalin is this king," and they have their mind goes back to times with autocratic monarchy where the king or the czar really was involved in lots of different decisions. So they kind of place that onto him. And that's not exactly a great historical methodology to use. Like, he should go to the source material right on the Soviet Union first before he starts using these frameworks. And I think we'll see more of this, where it's the framework is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for his interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I also wanted to add that technically you can say that in every state the power is more or less centralized around one figure. For example, you can say that in the United States the executive power was centralized around Franklin Roosevelt, and it's technically you would be right?
Right. But then we wouldn't say, that FDR had a ruthless purge, and but you could talk about the other leaders that way. That they got rid of their enemies and they supported their friends. But they don't use that to construct this very rigid mythology. And you can see on the screen right now this golden idol that these critics make of Stalin. They turn him into the golden calf when you could do that with Churchill or whoever.
By the way, they unironically do it with Churchill.
Right, exactly. They love him. There's a pub near my house that has this big painting of him up on the wall, and so yeah, people love to make idols out of these figures. And I'm sure in Russia, that's problematic. That has negative aspects as well. But yeah, they're not afraid to idolize and or lionize even as well, to turn them into these golden figures of history. They're not afraid to do that when it's a good guy like Churchill, as if Churchill was the most moral and good leader.
If I remember correctly, they even have entire Churchill Society in Britain that does nothing but promotes how Churchill was wholesome, great leader, etc., etc.
Yes, and unfortunately, we don't have much about FDR. I mean, for all of American presidents, he's really left behind in American history. Most Americans don't really care about FDR unless you're a DSA, Social Democrat type. Then he's your hero. But yeah, in America, we don't we lionize other figures, George Washington or even Ronald Reagan now. I mean, there's statues of him and everything's named after him now. So we even create idols out of very modern leaders here in America.
In general, I would say that you can see the author of the video started the actual video with saying that he will debunk some myths, that there are a lot of myths, and right from the start he just steps into one of them.
Right, and one thing I think we'll see going forward is that the myth, it does the work for him. The myth that is handed to him, and he hands it off to us. That's really does a lot of the creates a lot of the ideas that we're going to see him talking about. It just come from the myth, and he's relying on the audience to be familiar with the myth.
Notoriously paranoid and suspicious, Stalin entered the Second World War having just spent 3 years conducting the infamous Great Purge, which saw over half of the officers in the Red Army imprisoned or killed. But while some genuinely seditious elements were exposed, the purges also spilled an ocean of innocent blood, totaling at least 700,000 army personnel and 60,000 high-ranking officers.
So here what is important to say is that not only he continues spilling these myths, like Stalin was notoriously paranoid, suspicious, etc., etc., but also with wrong numbers. So he says that about 700,000 army personnel and 60,000 high-ranking officers were killed. The reality is that during the entire 1937-1938 period, there were about 36,000 or 37,000 arrested and dismissed commanders. We take into account that not all of them were killed. If we speak about Great Purge, some of them were dismissed due to natural causes, and some were arrested and, for example, dismissed but did not get executed. And, well, he says that 700,000 army personnel and 60,000 high-ranking officers, but the number of commanders in the entire Red Army by 1937 was just 200,000 people. There is an actual research on this topic, though it's in Russian. It's called The Real Impact of the Repressions of 1937-1938 on the Officer Corps in the Red Army. You can open it with Google or other browsers with built-in translator features and translate them to read them. So this article, the link is provided in the chat, counts the actual number of officers that were somehow arrested, executed, etc. So in reality, this number that he stated is way smaller. And it's important to mention that significant part of those who were arrested or dismissed were later restored in the ranks, because there was, after 1937, there was a special military commission created that studied each case in particular and decided whether this or that officer should be restored or they should be kept dismissed. And this is, for example, how Rokossovsky ended being in the army again. Go on.
Right, and clearly, if such a thing is possible, that they weren't executed on the day of their trial, which is basically what Armchair Historian and everyone else wants us to hear, that every single person who was purged was immediately taken outside and executed that same day. And so information like what you just talked about, that can't, that can't be fitted into the myth. That has to be disregarded. And he even touches on some of that. But then he says some genuinely seditious elements were exposed, is saying that, there was only the minority, the smallest minority of these people actually did anything wrong. But then he doesn't explain, this process of putting them on trial and prosecuting them as a legal process. It's as if this is Stalin's own personal anxiety has caused this to happen. There's no legal process. And then he uses words like spilling an ocean of innocent blood. At the same time as he said, well, yeah, there was a conspiracy. So he admits there were military, plots within the government, but then he says, don't pay attention to these real seditious elements when there's an ocean of innocent blood. And now we know that actually not everyone was executed. The purge doesn't mean executed. And this is a common canard, to use the word purge. And when Americans hear it, right, or people in general, they hear the word purge, they click in their mind with the myth, the Great Purge myth, and so they think, purge equals killing. And so this is, again, using the myth itself to do some heavy lifting for you.
Mm-hmm. It's worth adding as well that while there was indeed a lack of officers in the Red Army, the reason is usually explained in a simple way, like evil Stalin purged everyone, and therefore there were not enough officers in the Red Army, and therefore they lost in 1941. It looks simple, and indeed there was not enough officers, but the reason for this is not the Great Purge. The issue is that in 1939, not even 1937, in 1939, Red Army was about 2 million people. However, at the beginning of June 1941, Red Army was 5 million, and if you compare numbers, you can see that the army, the ranks of the army almost tripled in just 2 years. And not even 2 years, maybe a year and a half. And obviously you simply cannot prepare such amount of officers. So you basically need 2 more armies like the ones that you had. And you need officers somewhere. You simply cannot prepare them in 1.5 years. Tens of thousands of new officer positions were created, and they needed to be filled. Again, from the link that I put in the chat, you can read that in 1937, Voroshilov, which was the People's Commissar of Defense, reported that the army had 206,000 command personnel, according to the staff. And by June 15, 1941, the total number of officers, including commissars, including Air Force officers, including Navy and NKVD, was about 439,000 people. So it was only 85% of the staff. And therefore, it's clear that the shortage of officers was not caused by purges, but it was caused by preparing for war. You increase your army and you need officers. So by 1941, by June 22, 1941, they were still in training. And this element plays a key role when we will be speaking about Stalin's actions, about Soviet attitude towards war in general.
Stalin was obsessed with ideologically purifying his nation of all non-Soviet influencers, even if that meant killing men deemed too intelligent to make reliable underlings.
What an incredible use of language. Non-Soviet influencers. I don't think they had Instagram. Pardon my joke, but yeah, this is again we're seeing the myth being brought out.
I agree. To be honest, it looks like the author wants to say that Stalin repressed smart people.
Right, purifying his nation. You know, we're getting Stalin's personal obsession. We're getting into kind of Hitler equation, right? We're kind of equating him with Hitler in terms of this purity mania and things like this. But I really want to talk about. I want to touch on this myth. I think is very important in terms of the modern situation we're in with the development of politics. In my life, or in America right now, and in the Western countries in general, we're seeing a lot more people interested in socialism. We're seeing, especially young people, are really becoming interested in this history, and they come across these myths, and I see them really being believed. So these young people who are really interested in the history and really interested in learning about socialism, they come up across this myth, and basically they hear that Stalin is this great criminal who allowed this horrible thing to happen to the Soviet Union, right? That Stalin was this inept guy who allowed Hitler to kill so many Soviet citizens, and Stalin abused the socialist project and ruined it. People young socialists really believe this stuff. So talking about the history of World War II, talking about these myths, I think is really relevant. I just wanted to double down on why we're talking about this and why it matters, because this history of World War II really affects modern socialism and the ideas that young socialists are developing. A lot of them have a kind of allergy to Stalin and the Soviet Union in general, and so they embrace a lot of really wacky and different ideas, religious socialism or whatever else, because they see default socialism or more orthodox Marxism-leninism. That's you can't touch that because of this myth, and so they embrace all these really harmful deviations from regular Marxism that are causing all these splits in the movement, and we've seen that these deviationist alternatives to Marxism haven't turned out well. So I think an important task that we have for fighting these incorrect ideas and incorrect political ideas is to address the myths that are guiding people away from more authentic Marxism-Leninism and theory.
Mm-hmm. Here I would also add that there is a big negative narrative about Stalin, about Red Army, that evil Stalin purged officers who were not loyal to him, who were not loyal to the Soviet power, and it's like so bad. However, in reality, you cannot imagine any modern army without staff that is loyal to the ruling power. For example, Trump dismissed various generals from the Biden era almost immediately after he sneaked into the president office. And if we speak about loyalty and professionalism, it's obvious that generals are kept not only because of loyalty, but because of their professional skills. And there were lots of good generals in the staff, even after the purges, like Voroshilov, Budyonny, Timoshenko, Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Pavlov, Konev. All of them were far from ordinary officers at that time. And though they had less experience, though it can be said that in general, overall, Red Army had less experience than Wehrmacht. You cannot say that the Red Army was beheaded.
These murderous prejudices deeply affected the Soviet military doctrine, as many officers were killed simply for proposing changes influenced by capitalist thought processes. Promotion relied on adherence to proper communist ideals, while any demonstration of genuine talent or leadership ability amounted to a death sentence.
Whoa! Yeah, now that they present the myth and then they continue that presentation of the myth into a very literal kind of, if you demonstrate any talent, you die instantly. I mean, he starts off using very serious, historical language, and, the myth element of it is kind of only a small part of it at first, but now the myth is it. The myth is the heart of what he's talking about. And it goes into this, simply for proposing changes influenced by capitalist thought processes. And again, I think this is a liberal or someone who's kind of an outsider to Marxist theory, reading terms like bourgeois consciousness and things like this, or having bad consciousness, and they don't know how to interpret that. So they think it means if you want to make money, then you get shot. I think that they don't seriously approach these words that they're reading in the history text or in their analysis of the Soviet period. They see these words they don't understand, and then we see them kind of regurgitated without being properly digested in videos like this.
Mm-hmm. Imagine telling Armchair Historian that T-34 had American Christie tank as its direct predecessor.
Right, and was that, were they killed to hide that fact? Was Kalashnikov executed for being influenced by the M1 Garand in creating the AK and all these things? Where does it start and end? When does the punishment for being inspired by capitalist industry? When does that when do we see that carried out? Maybe where are the specific examples? I think maybe he's alluding to like Tukhachevsky and things like this, especially with the previous reference to purging genuine seditious elements. But he's not specific, and I think that's intentional, because once you get specific, then a critic could go in and say, oh, well, you interpreted this poorly. But in this, what we've just seen, he's able to be vague, and he's able to basically just present the myth just in its pure form.
Mm-hmm. I would even say that the whole narrative of communists purged anyone who was inspired by capitalism is very funny. The same person claimed again at the beginning of the video that they are going to debunk myths, that there are a lot of myths, and portraying themselves as someone who tries to give objective point of view. And then again we have bloody dictator Stalin, who beheaded the army, who purged anyone who disagreed with him, anyone who was smarter than him, anyone who was inspired by capitalism, whatever this means. In reality, the story goes in the completely opposite way. There are even debates up to the point that German army actually claimed they used various parts of Soviet doctrine. This is ongoing debate in the Russian historical science on how much did the Soviets influence the German tactics and strategy. Even if we speak about early 1930s, we can select there the triad of Tukhachevsky, Shaposhnikov, and Triandafilov, who laid the foundations for deep operation strategy, for overall Soviet military doctrine, and obviously they were combining everything that was available at the moment, the experience of the First World War, the experience of the Civil War, the experience of various local conflicts throughout 1920s and 1930s. And obviously you cannot say that Stalin purged or didn't allow anything inspired by capitalism, especially if we remember 5-year plans when a lot of industry was literally bought from the United States with cheap prices, and though repressions could slow down this development, they didn't amount to the destruction of all talents or, again, beheading the army. Alright, and we're going next.
Surprisingly enough, at the same time the Red Army was suffering through the worst of the purges, it was also seeing an unprecedented period of growth and rearmament. While historians have frequently debated Stalin's motives and geopolitical outlook during the 1930s, the majority agree that he foresaw a major conflict within the next decade, and he had no intention of presiding over another disastrous defeat.
Seems reasonable.
Yeah, so at the end, he accepts that there was indeed a danger of war, and the Bolsheviks were just preparing for it. Though obviously, thinking in his way doesn't allow you to go further and admit that in such conditions, measures to strengthen the army in the rear were justified. Obviously, if you're speaking about communists, they are always to be blamed, they are always bad, and he simply remains silent about this. Though again, he states that there was a threat of war, and if you stop watching this video and just try to think, so Bolsheviks are preparing for war, they try to clean their ranks from potential spies, from potential guys who could overthrow the government. It's quite justified, isn't it?
Right, and if you'll forgive another joke, it's using the visual element, this visual communication that Armchair Historian is doing. It's as if Stalin has invented this robot bear, Misha, it seems like his name is, but he won't release the robot bear on Europe. And I think this is touching on this myth that Stalin developed this huge military apparatus, but then he refused to use it, basically. That seems to be what they're touching on. But yes, why don't you release the robot bear that you've invented? I don't know, it just seems it's kind of between this seriousness that he wants it to have and this kind of childish cartoon robot bear that he has, the cartoon element is directly kind of communicating information to the audience that he wants communicated. So I don't know, it's just very curious to see him trying to do that. And I think we'll see that in his next section.
This illustrates the strange dualistic nature of Stalin's war preparations, which saw him pouring vast resources into the military while simultaneously ripping out its teeth to ensure it couldn't be used against him. Stalin also actively courted the attention of Adolf Hitler. Several high-ranking defectors have claimed Stalin.
He courted the attention. What does this mean? So I'm pretty sure the Soviet Union had Hitler's attention going a while back, a couple decades at least.
Sure. I would also add that the logic there is very questionable, because admitting that the communists were right means admitting that Stalin was guided by logic and he was not a thoughtless tyrant. And if we speak about capitalist historiography, they simply cannot do this. And therefore, all these very weird jumps back and forth. Again, if you stop watching the video and just try to think about it. So Stalin knew that the war was coming. He was preparing for war, industry was preparing for war, producing new weapons, producing more weapons, tanks, airplanes. The army is being cleaned of unstable officers, and well, everything seems quite justified there, right? But he goes into there was some sort of idealistic nature, that he was preparing for war, yet trying to keep army beheaded. Like, you start to think, and you think either Stalin was very, very stupid or he was insane. And this is what they try to brainwash us into.
And I want to touch on one theory that I think he's alluding to with that line about courting the attention of Hitler. I think he's touching on theories such as from the book Stalin's War by McMeekin. And this concept that you see in other books as well was this idea that Stalin wanted to trick Hitler into invading the Soviet Union, which is just, it's a strange theory, but that Stalin was intentionally trying to seem weak or intentionally holding back his military from developing, intentionally losing in Spain and things like this in order to draw Hitler into this huge war that Hitler would get bogged down in, and that would allow the Soviet Union to conquer Germany, basically. And I think, this is a very dangerous myth, this concept that Stalin wanted World War II to happen, as opposed to the reality, which is that Stalin predicted, or people in general, not just Stalin, everyone knew that there was going to be a war in Europe, particularly with Hitler's Germany. So they turned that basic understanding of modern reality, right, for these people living in the 1930s and 40s, understanding that there probably would be a war, and they're taking that into saying, no, Stalin actually wanted and made this war happen through diplomacy, through all these schemes.
I would say that actually the whole fact that Hitler declared the war was actually Stalin's victory, and we will prove it later when we discuss the specific parts of the video.
Stalin believed a new world war would trigger socialist uprisings in Europe, which the USSR would sweep to the aid of. Others have claimed that Stalin couldn't care less about international socialism, but instead wanted to recapture the various Tsarist territories that splintered from Russia during the revolution. Still, others believe Stalin held Hitler in very high regard, considering him a kindred spirit thanks to their shared authoritarian values. Regardless of Stalin's real motives, he planned on keeping the USSR out of conflict until it was ready to fight an offensive war sometime in the 1940s.
I haven't seen this video before, so some of this is really tickling me.
You want to say something?
Well, I guess we could touch on the second theory that he lists about that Stalin didn't care about international socialism, which I think we could tear that apart as well. But he shows the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and he also shows Finland. So he's kind of saying that World War II was instigated by Stalin. So again, we're touching on this myth that Stalin basically created World War II from nothing, right? He tricked Hitler into starting World War II. Anyway, in order to seize Finland. And I think, a lot of people in the West are very focused on the Winter War, or should I say the Soviet-Finnish War, and the continuation war after that. But kind of saying that, Stalin wanted to conquer Finland. Well, he didn't. And people say, Finland prevented the Soviets from taking over. Finland won the wars. But really, this is another myth unto itself. And I just want to point out that the Soviet Union did win in Finland, basically. The Soviet Union accomplished its goals, but they chose not to take control of the Finnish government. And I think that's, if that was Stalin's grand goal for this enormous war that killed millions of people that Hitler started and that involved the entire world, why would Stalin fail to accomplish this secret goal of conquering Finland, especially when, it was kind of resolved diplomatically in the end that Finland didn't join the Warsaw Pact. Finland didn't, have its government overthrown by the Soviets. So what's the reason why? So he presents this idea, this myth, this, theory, his second theory that he lists of three. But why he doesn't explain why that didn't work out. And basically, I think he would have to, if he was going to defend that thing about Finland, he would have to lean on that myth that, the Finnish actually defeated the Soviets and the Soviets wanted to conquer Finland, but they failed.
I did that the author seemed to agree that Stalin was preparing for war and buying time, so we can say it was all that simple. But then he immediately declares that Stalin wanted an offensive war, that is, he wanted to attack first. And the myth of the Red Threat was the cornerstone of Nazi propaganda back in 1941. They were saying we're simply launching a preemptive strike so that we're not attacked first. This is exactly how they justified the beginning of war in 1941. And by the way, this is used up until nowadays. We saw exactly the same argument in action just a week ago in the Middle East.
And I want to touch on briefly another myth that he mentioned about Stalin's affinity for Hitler, how they both had kind of a brotherly dictator bond. And as a historian, he's says that he's a historian. We now have these documents from the personal lives of Stalin and Hitler. You know, we know what breakfast they had on such and such day. We know so much about what they said and what they did. So we know how Stalin viewed Hitler. There's been several books written about it. We know how Hitler viewed Stalin. And I would point out for that third theory he just referenced, he says that Stalin had kind of an affection for Hitler. In fact, we don't see that in historical record. That's kind of debunked in the historical record, as far as I've read, that actually Hitler had some kind of affection for Stalin, and he had Stalin's earlobes examined to make sure he wasn't Jewish and things like this, because Hitler had such an affection for Stalin. But this wasn't reciprocated, that Stalin was kind of dismissive of Hitler. He kind of looked down on Hitler. So this idea that Stalin had some secret affection for Hitler, and because of that secret personal affection, that he wanted to preserve the Nazi state, basically. This seems nonsense. That Stalin would have some kind of personal affinity, and thus would make entire diplomatic and military decisions about Nazi Germany because of that. It doesn't seem like a serious historical view.
Mm-hmm. And one minor note I want to add is, have you ever thought that the term war of continuation is actually a substitute for we were Hitler's allies in World War II?
Right, that's another part of the Finnish conflict. People don't talk about. They don't talk about that Finland. They don't talk about what Finland was doing in the 1910s and 20s with their kind of what they had peasant, or I shouldn't even say peasant, but they had land speculators going into the Soviet Union trying to take land for Finnish people, expand Finnish. This was in the after 1917 and in the early 20s, that they were trying to take land in Karelia, and they had to be defeated there. And they don't talk about this myth about Finland. Doesn't talk about Finland's role, besieging Leningrad and. All the things that the Finnish government was doing as an ally of Germany, that doesn't come into it at all. Yeah, and they dismiss kind of some interesting facts about the lead up to World War II, that Finland and Hitler were kind of collaborating, and there was a fear that Hitler would send troops to Finland and seize land that way by using Finland as as a corridor to attack the Soviet Union. That these kinds of things are never touched upon for why Stalin would be concerned about Finland or the Baltics.
Mm-hmm. I would also add that the story of Finland working with Germans goes as far as back to 1918, when Germans helped destroy the workers' uprising in Finland. Though I think it's something for a different stream, and now we're going further.
Thanks to his close diplomatic ties with Nazi Germany, Stalin gained the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August of 1939, which included a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe between the two powers. After war broke out in September, the Red Army moved into the eastern half of Poland with little resistance. Stalin then turned his attention to Finland, whose administration contained many White Russian exiles. After Finland refused to cede its border territories and join the Soviet-led bloc in the Baltic, Stalin ordered an invasion, only to witness his handcrafted Red Army take nearly 4-1 casualties against the determined Finnish defenders. Confronted with a butcher's bill of nearly 170,000 men, Stalin was forced to sit down with his top military commanders and begin inquiries into analyzing the disaster. Unsurprisingly, these revealed a shocking lack of initiative amongst Soviet commanders, embarrassingly poor coordination between units, a total inability to rapidly communicate with frontline troops, and massive logistical issues.
So here, while describing the alleged horrors of the Winter War and the bravery of the so-called determined Finnish defenders, among whom were many war criminals and simply fascists, who were supported plus by France and Britain, the author is simply silent about the fact that the USSR actually won the Winter War. This is probably the biggest thing that you can use to debunk all the cope that is usually spilled around this issue, like while trying to portray the USSR as losers. All the fans of liberal propaganda just stay silent about the fact that the USSR, well, won the war, and the results of this war are actually how do you say? So I want to say that the results of this war are preserved up until nowadays. We know that these parts that the USSR wanted to be a part of the Soviet territory. By the way, again, Armchair is silent about the fact that it wasn't just a demand. The USSR actually offered an exchange and even offered way more land in Karelia than they wanted in exchange. But it would break the narrative of evil totalitarian communists trying to invade Finland and determined Finnish resistance. In general, when we talk about the approach to the USSR and to Western countries, we see that, for example, when it comes to the failures of France in 1940, they usually emphasize that Hitler was too strong, too fast, poor unfortunate France could not do anything. However, when it comes to the failures of the USSR, the emphasis is put on the fact that the leaders of the USSR were fools, they were tyrants, they were blockheads who were rightly beaten for their mistakes. And if there were any victories, they were in spite of this leadership. So there is always a negative narrative towards the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. And I want to touch on something you mentioned briefly about the determined Finnish defenders being, war criminals and fascists. Is this is even in his text itself from the video that Armchair Historian says. He says it here. Pardon me. That Finland, whose administration contained many white Russian exiles. So he's touching on something there. Like, why would he bring up the white Russian exiles in the Finnish government and then just move on as if that fact doesn't matter at all? Why even bring it up? And I think it's kind of like his earlier attempts to say, some of these myths were invented by Nazi Germany during the war. There really were some conspiracies in the Red Army. It's kind of a continuation of that, where he's admitting to some reality that the Soviets are responding to. That why would he even mention that the administration contains white Russian exiles? Well, it's because these people are fascists, the leadership of Finland, and they're aligned with Hitler. So it's kind of like a sideways way to acknowledge that the government of Finland was kind of aligned with Hitler, was kind of aligned with this fascist ideological project. So he can touch on it briefly to kind of undermine his critics, but then he just leaves those facts on the floor as if he didn't mention them at all. And I think that's very important in telling that this is something that we communists have to do to debunk. That these historians, these anti-communists, mythologists, they know about the response. They know about that there were white Russian exiles leading the Finnish government, and they want to cut us off at the knees before we bring that up. But they fail to really engage with those facts. And so it's up to us to bring up those facts and say, hey, the leadership of Finland by fascists and their alliance with Hitler, this is relevant for the history of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Enormous reforms in both doctrine and equipment were required, but serious problems continued to go unaddressed. Chief among them were the political commissars, who held the power to execute officers for practically any reason. Given his extremely weak military position and the ease with which the clearly rotten Western democracies were failing beneath the heel of the German jackboot, Stalin realized he needed time to consolidate his gains and avoid additional bloodshed for now. But this caused Stalin to become unhealthily.
So it's unclear from this passage, was the army strong or weak? Did Stalin want to conquer Europe or not? Armchair Historian sometimes talks about an offensive war, sometimes he talks about Stalin's vulnerable position, so it's unclear at the end, did Stalin want an offensive war, or did he want to avoid the war?
And I just want to touch on something that he's kind of admitting to again, that he says that the purges were so harmful, but at the same time he says, in the previous section of the video, he says that the time of the purges also saw an unprecedented period of growth and rearmament. So he's referencing this idea of the purges and the need for reforms, and that there were reforms going on, but he doesn't seem to connect the concept that if you're having a reform, that would involve removing officials or removing army officers who are kind of in the way of that reform, or who don't represent that reform. And so he brings up the purges, but he doesn't. But like we said, purges means killing, as opposed to we're replacing one army officer for another because of these ongoing reforms as well. And I know that the Great Purges, this is a larger thing that we need to discuss, but I just want to point out that if purges does not mean killing and it means replacing an officer for another officer, we can see how this would be related to what he calls an unprecedented period of growth and rearmament. So purging is something we could connect to the reforms, and if you're going to have a reform process, that means by default that you're going to be replacing certain officers with other officers in order to implement that reform.
Plus, don't forget, when they speak about American or British armies, it's rotation, it's restructuring, it's improving the quality, and if you speak about the Red Army, it's always purges, it's about purging the smartest men, etc., etc.
Right, somehow the Red Army is constantly failing, constantly in disaster, and these purges are so negative, and yet he understands that there is a positive process of reform and rearmament, and as he's going to talk about in a second.
Mm-hmm.
Obsessed with preserving peace with Germany. His belief that Hitler would not invade while at war with Great Britain was initially reasonable, but he clung to it far beyond the point of rationality, even rejecting intelligence from his own agents in Berlin and Tokyo.
Again, it's his unhealthy personal obsession. It's all about the personal mindset of the dictator. Great man theory, of course. All serious historians love great man theory. I say ironically, most historians are now more responsible about great man theory, and yet we see it here that it's Stalin's personal obsessions are behind diplomatic mistakes, I guess.
Mm-hmm. The author is so naive, saying that Stalin was unhealthily obsessed. Firstly, the author seems simply not to think that every day of peace means every day of growth of the Soviet power. Every day new T-34s and KVs, new cars, trucks, machine tools, planes are produced. Every day new soldiers are trained, new officers. Of course, nobody believed in its indestructibility, but they wanted to delay the war as long as possible. And it must be said that they actually almost delayed it. June 22nd was, according to some data, one of the latest deadlines for German attack. And if France had held out for example, a month longer in 1940, then perhaps the attack on the USSR would have been postponed to 1942, and then the Germans would have had it even worse. And by the way, if we speak about France, the winner of World War One, the nation with one of the strongest armies in Europe, held against Germans for just 2 months. And then it just fell apart, despite the fact that the Wehrmacht in 1940 was still less experienced and equipped than in 1941. Plus, when speaking about Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Armchair Historian again is completely silent on the story behind this agreement. He's completely silent on the fact that France and the UK simply refused to sign anything with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union held talks, but they realized that Western countries don't want to do anything serious when the delegations of British and French nations arrived without any authority to sign anything with the Soviet Union. Plus, by the way, this information is nowhere to be seen in the Western sphere. Though we have this information from German archives that there were actually talks between Germany and the Great Britain at that period. And if Stalin did not sign a pact with Hitler, it would have been probably the Great Britain signing the pact with Hitler. And we all know that UK had strong pro-German lobby back at that time.
Yeah, so of course, especially among industry and chemical and weapons manufacturing, there were a lot of deals even between the U.S. and Britain as well, or U.S. and Germany as well. But I wanted to touch on another bit of naivete from Armchair Historian from this section we just heard, particularly about intelligence from his own agents in Berlin and Tokyo. So this is clearly a reference, at least the Tokyo part, to Richard Sorge. And hopefully I'm saying that correctly, that this was a high-ranking spy who was a leader of a espionage ring in Japan at the time. And I think later he was arrested after the war was over, which kind of tells you something about this intelligence. But he says that Stalin just rejected intelligence from his own agents in Tokyo. Why would any leader of any country just receive direct intelligence reports from one spy, right? Why would it go from a spy's mouth to the president's ears? This is not a serious interpretation of how the intelligence reports from Tokyo that were kind of Richard Sorge got access to the German transmissions with their Japanese allies, and Sorge reported that they were talking about the invasion of the Soviet Union. But you can't trust every single thing you hear from your spies. Like this world of intelligence, it can't be so easily parsed through that you can say, oh, a spy reported it, then it must be true. No, there's all sorts of things going on at this time that Stalin was actually aware of as well, that the Germans were planting fake stories. And this was even the Allies did this. The Allies planted huge fake stories that the Germans would hear about. And famously on D-Day, they tricked the Germans into thinking that D-Day would happen on the other side of Europe. And so spies are often you have to interpret what spies are saying, and spies are often giving information that can't be confirmed or would need to be confirmed from other sources. So the idea that Stalin should be directly listening to Richard Sorge with no filter and just believe what he hears from this one particular spy that Armchair Historian references directly, it just doesn't seem serious, and it's just kind of like Wikipedia history at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is the exact thing he will be talking right now.
In a report from Lavrinti Beria regarding the prospect of an invasion, Stalin wrote, "You can tell your source from the German air headquarters that he can go and his mother. This is not a source, but disinformation." In a similar display of mature...
So there we need to speak just a little bit about intelligence narrative. Comrade Thomas has already done it, and I would add that there is one big, well, it's kind of myth and kind of story that intelligence officers and defectors reported numerous times about Germans invading, but of course the foolish communists and Stalin personally did not believe them, and therefore they missed the war. What is important here is that the information that you receive can be unreliable, it can be false, it can be fake, it can be simply provocation. And it's now in 2025 that we know that on the evening of June 21st, German troops were preparing for an attack. But back then, the official information was that Wehrmacht was preparing to celebrate the anniversary of the victories in Eastern Prussia in 1914. And there were various sources that tried to say that the war would happen soon, and these messages were going straight from the beginning of May, and they were almost always like, the war is going to happen in 2 days, in 3 days, but then time passes by and there is no any war. And if you look from these positions, you can understand why Stalin didn't believe them, because there were simply lots of them, and all of them were saying that it's going to take place tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, or next week, and it probably really looked like false information. Plus, we have to take into account the preemptive strike story. This is something that we will return to a little bit later.
And I wanted to touch on, one last thing about that this is really taking the perspective of kind of a smug hindsight, where you're saying that, using hindsight, you're saying, oh, of course, Germany invaded in June 1941. Well, yes, but as you said, they didn't know that Germany would invade on that date at that time. And so with hindsight, we say, oh, of course, Stalin should have known that they would invade at this date, at this time, when with hindsight, we dismiss other reports. So why would we take one report, with the absolute faith that it's real, whereas other reports, with hindsight, we can say, oh, they never should have believed those reports. Well, who's to say which one was real? Except in hindsight, we see with history, it proves what was real and what was fake. But there were reports that Germany would send troops to Finland and invade from Finland and attack the Soviet Union. There's lots of reports that didn't end up happening, or even real German plans that the Soviet spies would have found out about, and that didn't come to fruition. So with hindsight, you can kind of have this smug attitude when it's just not a very serious understanding of how these reports are coming and going, and some reports are false.
Mm-hmm. Just before we continue, I'd like to say hello to everyone who joined us recently. Today we are watching the Armchair Historian about the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, and explaining what is wrong with his position, with general myths about USSR in 1941. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and support us by following the links which you can see at the bottom part of your screen.
Stalin responded to the perfectly accurate reports from Agent Richard Sorge in Tokyo that 9 armies would attack the USSR on the 22nd of June by calling him a little... Stalin also believed that even if the unthinkable did happen, his existing defenses could hold out until a full mobilization. Said defenses consisted of a thin red line of divisions stretched across the vast Soviet border territories, all with orders never to retreat, and no radios to coordinate a retreat anyway.
Well, you can notice that the story with a negative narrative is here again. And not only this, but he's telling outright lies. Just several minutes ago, he said that Stalin expected war and was preparing for it, and now he says that the unthinkable would happen. Like, Stalin did not think that the war would happen. Firstly, the Soviet defense didn't consist of this so-called thin red line that he showed on the screen. It actually consisted of 3 strategic echelons, and there were no thin red lines. Again, the author claimed to debunk myths, but in fact he is only broadcasting them. There was a system of border outposts, the border service. There was a system of territorial units, which, by the way, they had already abandoned by the beginning of the war. Finally, there were regular divisions, and there were mechanized corps. These were huge formations of motorized, tank, and air units. Plus, the story about there was no radio is just a lie, and it's such a lie that it's just funny. Like, imagine the Soviets didn't have a radio. Get it? They were so stupid, obviously.
Yeah, and it gets into this ridiculous myth that, well, it's kind of like the not one step back kind of myth, or the idea that they didn't give them radios so that they couldn't retreat. I mean, this is, it's pure mythology, as opposed to just kind of saying, oh, they lacked, kind of radio equipment. And I think there are some studies that talk about, or there, some historical examination you could make that, the Soviet forces didn't have as many radios as other armies. The planes and tanks didn't have as many radios as other armies did. And I think you can talk about the economy and everything that led to that. But then to say that, oh, actually this was an intentional plan by Stalin, let's keep all of our armies in the dark and they can't even talk to each other so they don't retreat. And of course the silly thing that they're kind of saying the not one step back order, which was from later in the war, they act as if that was, which is already mythologized, that from later on, they act as if that's was from even before the war started. The one not one step back order was issued, and so it's like kind of confusing itself in this web of mythology.
I would add that this narrative is used to fuel this false image of Stalin as a somewhat insane person who was just doing good and bad things without any order, and it just happened this way that he succeeded somehow in the greatest war in history, which is obviously funny.
Right, as if his generals are all coming up to Stalin and begging him, please give them radios. And Stalin says, no, you cannot have even a single, I don't want them retreating, so we can't give them, which is, I mean, it's just ridiculous. And he presents it as if it's like, oh, of course, this is just the facts of history. We didn't, Stalin didn't want them to retreat, so he didn't give them radios.
Fortunately, some officers of the Red Army foresaw the inevitable and risked their lives to prepare for a German attack. On May 15th, General Alexander Vasilevsky worked with Georgy Zhukov and Semyon Timoshenko to formulate a strategy that called for the Red Army to absorb the German attack and then counterattack to destroy the bulk of enemy forces and fight the war on foreign soil.
Wait, so they were actually... Firstly, the Red Army was not actually beheaded. There were generals who were actually preparing for war on a tactical level, and, well, they were preparing for war, they were not just sitting. Though these exact things the author tried to explain to us a few minutes ago.
The plan proposed a preemptive strike against the invasion force and requested Stalin permit a covert mobilization. Stalin either never read the plan or instantly rejected it, but even experienced generals substantially underestimated the speed of the German buildup.
Wait, which was it? Did he reject it or did he not read it? Like, don't we have the documents where it'll show, like, his signature at the bottom?
Well, obviously it's not true that they allegedly did nothing. We see industry, army, training, preparations, and regarding the mobilization and preemptive strikes, again, let's assume that they started them and suddenly all the Soviet troops are moving, and this would obviously be immediately used by Germany, like, look, they're preparing for attack, here's the evidence, we're launching a preemptive strike.
And I think he touches on the problems with the myth that he's presenting, right? He says that even experienced generals underestimated the speed of the German buildup. I mean, we could compare that to French generals, right? We talked about the French army was one of the most competent armies in the whole world at the time. Some of the best tanks in the world were being made in France at that time. but they, even these people who were competent generals in the Soviet Union or in France, the German strategy was successful. So you can't exactly pin that on Stalin's own, kind of sabotage of the process, when clearly there's something real going on with the German buildup.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only on the 21st of June that Stalin finally issued an alert order, which reached the front lines a whole 1 hour before the attack began. Even in this last communique, Stalin showed his reluctance to believe the obvious by saying, "The task of our troops is not to respond to any provocative actions that might result in serious complications."
It's just funny how liberals claim that Stalin wanted to attack first, and then they immediately accuse him of being such a fool that he didn't attack first. Like, are you so stupid? You should have attacked first. And again, what would have happened then? Imagine the USSR starts mobilization or even declares war. Then what we would have? Britain would not have been so inclined to work with the USSR, and perhaps it would have even made peace with Germany, because there was again strong pro-German lobby. Germany wasn't winning the war, and they could just sign a white peace. The USA, even more so. We know, for example, guys like Truman openly stated, we need to support one side until the other is weakened. And accordingly, it could have turned out that Lend-Lease would have gone not to the USSR, but to Germany. Especially since anti-communist hysteria had been fueled for decades, and Hitler, which we will speak about a little bit later, tried to position his whole propaganda narratives about uniting Europe against the Bolshevik menace.
And I'd like to briefly touch on the context of military provocation at that time that Stalin, the quote that they show on screen from Stalin, is responding to. So you've got things like the Marco Polo Bridge incident. You've got the German false flag with Poland, where each fascist state, each incredibly aggressive military regime needs to, despite their militarism, despite their development in arms, they still need to say that Poland attacked Germans. Poland was repressing local Germans. Poland attacked a German border station. That was the false flag. That the Chinese attacked Japanese holdings in the mainland. So this is the context of history at that time that people like Armchair Historian are kind of leaving out, that there really were these intense and many other operations to provoke the other side or make it seem like the other side is the aggressor in order to accomplish a lot of what Vasily mentioned about Lend-Lease and diplomacy, right? Today, with hindsight, again, it seems ridiculous that Poland would be the aggressor against Germany or that China would be the aggressor against Japan. But at that time, this is factually what the aggressors wanted to present. They wanted it to be perhaps just unclear and to confuse the diplomatic situation. But the fact is that there really were these serious provocations that could be used to kind of bait the Soviet Union into a bad situation.
Mm-hmm. And again, just reminding that this entire preemptive strike construction is used up until nowadays. And all of our viewers who are watching us right now experienced this just a week ago.
At 3:15 a.m. on the 22nd of June 1941, over 3 million German troops crashed through the Soviet border defenses with unstoppable force. The Red Army was caught in the middle of major reforms, and commanders failed to exercise even the most rudimentary coordination between infantry and artillery. Stalin himself was completely blindsided by the invasion and wasted precious hours entertaining the notion that it was all a hideous mistake. When he came to his senses, his first moves were to order the evacuation of Soviet industry to the Urals and establish a General Supreme Command, or Stavka, with himself at the top. But Stalin allegedly suffered a breakdown on the 28th after the fall of Minsk and fled to his private residence outside of Moscow. After 2 whole days in solitude, a delegation of senior Soviet officials convinced him to return, whereupon he threw himself into organizing a series of massive counteroffensives, while doubling down on his policy of no retreat and no surrender.
So, this is a fairly common myth, which was started by Mikoyan, a member of the Central Committee who was later big friends with Khrushchev. In his memoirs, he painted the whole story as if Stalin went to his dacha in hysterics and the whole delegation went to drag him out of there. These memoirs were published in the late 1990s, and they are not actually his memoirs. These are recordings that were processed by his son. And usually it is found in the context of the fact that after the start of the war, Stalin allegedly fell into prostration and did nothing for the first days. This myth is refuted by the Kremlin visitor log, which indicates Stalin's intense work in the first week of the war. And the author of the video talks about the fall of Minsk, but this is not actually the point. The real catastrophe back then was that the telephone line between headquarters in Moscow and headquarters of the Western Front was broken. And the situation acquired elements of uncontrolled chaos. And of course, in such conditions, you must take into account the enormous psychological burden, the responsibility that laid on Stalin. Here, just one minor thing is that Armchair Historian showed on the screen that Stalin organized Stavka with him as a head, like trying to portray it as another proof of Stalin's will to power. Like, he's a bloody dictator. Obviously, he wanted to guide everything by himself. However, it's just that Stalin was the head of the Soviet government, and well, when it's about defending the whole country, obviously the leader of the country would lead this committee. So if we return to this story about Stalin's alleged hysteria, of greater value are Molotov's memoirs, which he wrote independently of Mikoyan. And Molotov said that indeed, he wrote on the second or third day of the war, though most likely on the 27th or 28th, Stalin, Molotov, Beria, and Malenkov went to the People's Commissariat of Defense. And after that, they all went to the state dacha. There was no Stalin ran in panic, they moved all together. And Molotov writes that Stalin was indeed in a difficult state. However, he held up well. Again, Molotov records no any hysterics. He just writes that Stalin said, well, we all, fucked up. And the other leaders were able to cheer him up. And that's it. No any hysterics, no any rolling on the floor, as some wrote. Just an ordinary situation that happens when you lose control over such an important sphere of your work.
Right. Do they want Stalin to be some kind of robot who is unfeeling about all this horrible situation with the war? They can't make up their mind about what they want Stalin to be, either incredibly emotional and paranoid or uncaring and unfeeling about, all this these horrible events of that time. But I wanted to touch on again the idea of the hysterics that he says that Armchair Historian claims that he went from hysteria to issuing these first orders. And what were these first orders? Were the evacuation of Soviet industry to the Urals and the establishment of himself as like a central figure. So again, it's kind of asking, well, wasn't Stalin already the head of a centralized state apparatus? According to the myth that we've been hearing this whole time, Stalin was kind of personally overseeing every aspect of the military before the war. So why would he need to create this special wartime kind of emergency powers body? And at the same time, the evacuation of Soviet industry to the Urals. Are we supposed to believe that this is something bad or hysterical, when in fact it seems that the evacuation to the Urals was very smart, that it was actually pretty important, that if the war did go badly, that would have been a very important thing to have happened. The having industry in the Urals would be able to, that would make the country more able to win the war. So it's very interesting the mythology he creates. And I just want to touch on Mikoyan again because he is constantly cited in Western historiography. So I think that's why we're seeing Mikoyan here for Armchair Historian. History departments in the West really love the Mikoyan's book. It's really just the one book. But the background, to give a little more of the background of Mikoyan, I believe he's from the Yugoslav Communist Party, but his situation when he wrote that book was he's kind of caught between the Soviet Union. He doesn't like, he kind of abandoned the Soviet Union, and he abandoned Tito's Yugoslavia. So he doesn't support, his own country, Yugoslavia, or the Soviet Union, and he's kind of cornered himself into kind of a pro-Western kind of, or at least the West really picked up him and his work. So, I think Mikoyan is a bad cornerstone for this guy's history. When there's so many other history books and so many other sources that you can use, why does he rely on this kind of this one book by Mikoyan that really should be critically viewed as being extremely politically biased, I should say. Really, it's politically motivated in writing.
The thing is that these again memoirs were not written by Mikoyan. They were recorded and then composed in a proper way by his son, and they were published in 90s when the situation in Russia was that when you said anything against Stalin, you were paid, you had fame, etc., etc. They paid for saying anything against Stalin. And therefore, this is why a lot of things popped up in the 90s.
This culminated in Order 270, which read in part, "Those falling into encirclements are to fight to the last. Those who prefer to surrender are to be destroyed by all available means." The order was enforced by Stalin's political commissars, who were empowered to countermand the orders of operational commanders and administer summary executions without trial. On July 3rd, he addressed his nation for the first time since the start of the invasion and called for a patriotic war. He also recognized the British as allies, declaring the conflict part of a united front of peoples standing for freedom.
Well, again, having extracted the image of Stalin as the only leader in the USSR, Armchair Historian started to believe in it himself. Well, in reality, the first address to the nation was made not by Stalin, but by Molotov. Again, right on June 22nd. And that address was edited by Stalin and other members of the Politburo. Again, this is something that Molotov himself said in his memoirs.
This speech marked a turning point in Stalin's
we can go on.
All right, say what you wanted.
Pardon me, but we can go on, but I just wanted to comment on, saying those who prefer to surrender are to be destroyed by all available means. This is clearly a translation, right? They translated from Russian, and they say they are choosing to use the word, those who prefer to surrender are to be destroyed, when you could use other words. They're using a word that, kind of directly implies kill all people who speak out, kill anyone who's a free thinker. This is what's implied, but they're making an intentional translation choice with that use of the word destroyed. I mean, I don't know the original Russian. Vasily, maybe you know what word was originally used, but yeah, it's clearly we're being coached into a certain view.
I didn't read the original text of that order, though it's quite easy to find. I just wanted to say that I don't know if it seems that Armchair Historian wants to portray this order as something bad. Though I have to say that in the situation like what was taking place in late June 1941, when there was indeed complete chaos and low morale among the Red Army soldiers, these orders were something that brought order. And this, plus Order 227, which took place in summer 1942, a lot of generals and commanders recall that this order had big influence. It literally rose the spirit boosted morale and helped them organize their soldiers. So it actually fulfilled its role, and there is nothing bad in it. I don't know. Yeah, just wanted to say that it seems that he wants to conduct the narrative of, I would say, making tough orders is bad or something. I don't know. It seems he wanted the Red Army to end like France or what?
Right, and how many people were executed under this order? Unlike the previous thing where we talk about the purges, he gives specific numbers. He says, 760,000 people were killed. Why not talk about how many were executed under this order? When it's this is a pretty standard thing. Even in the American military, I could make comparisons. But, the name of the order is on in English, it's on the responsibility of military personnel for surrendering and leaving weapons to the enemy. It just says that those who take off their insignia from their uniforms and desert or surrender are to be considered deserters. This is a pretty standard anti-desertion order that you would have in other in the American military. Many people during World War II, which was not a very emergent, it's not a very big emergency for America, right? In World War II, they weren't defending their own homeland. Even for Americans, we executed people who deserted. So it's not that strange for a military to prosecute deserters. I believe we killed hundreds of American soldiers by execution afterwards under similar circumstances. So I don't know. Yeah, we're just meant to, because of the myth, we're meant to interpret this in a certain way, right? We're getting a conclusion handed to us instead of thinking, well, isn't desertion a crime in most militaries?
Mm-hmm. Just don't forget, it's good and rational when it's done in the American or British armies, but it's bad and irrational when it's done in the Soviet army.
As he began to replace ideological sentiment with patriotism, emphasizing this as a grand struggle for the Soviet people rather than a battle between communism and fascism. Ironically enough, it was perhaps Hitler's unswerving dedication to the extermination of the Slavic people that helped Stalin power through his darkest moments, leaving him with a binary choice: accept certain death or fight as hard as possible to avert it.
Well, I want to say here that the truth is that when Germans took prisoners of war, especially in 1941, only two groups were ordered not to be taken as prisoners, but shot on sight. These were commissars, communists, and Jews. So saying that Stalin abandoned some ideological principles and started moving towards simple, if we can so, patriotism is, I would say, a wrong image of what happened in reality. Like, yes, this was a struggle for the Soviet people, for entire Soviet nation. It was a struggle for liberating the peoples of Europe, but it was also a battle between communism and fascism. It was just that...
Right.
It was just that all the good guys were sided with communists and all the bad guys were sided with fascists. That's quite simple.
Right, and I think it's a complete falsity to say that the Soviets didn't use propaganda that mentioned communism or fascism. I'm pretty sure if you look at the posters and the different propaganda material at the time, fascism is mentioned, communism is mentioned, and the war is often described as a battle between socialism, kind of socialist civilization versus fascist barbarism, things like this are constantly used. So I think it's just a complete falsehood to say that, Stalin kind of set aside the socialist values and embraced kind of nationalism at this time. I think that's, again, he's kind of blowing something up and kind of disregarding the evidence that contradicts it.
Mm-hmm. And something important that I want to add here is that remember how previously we spoke about Stalin trying to prevent war till the very last, hour. The thing is that the Armchair Historian speaks about Britain, about Stalin reaching Britain, something like that the British were just sitting and waiting till bad Stalin would reach them, and then they would forgive him and fight on his side. The reality is that, and Stalin constantly emphasized it in his speeches throughout the war, that it was not the Soviet Union who attacked Germany, it was Germany that attacked the Soviet Union, and it played a great role for the rest of the world. People saw that it was Nazi Germany that was an aggressor, and the Soviet Union was defending, and therefore the emotions and hopes of all the nations were connected with the Soviet victory. And this is why Britain, I'm just reminding that Britain back then was ruled by Churchill, and Churchill was staunch anti-communist. Like this dude literally intervened in Russia in 1918. He is the same guy who made the Fulton speech, which started the Cold War. And this guy had to reach out the Soviet Union and be friends with communists. It's like, imagine Trump being friends with communists. It's something unbelievable. Yet Churchill was literally Trump back then, and he said, sure, we will work with Stalin, we will help the Soviet Union, and we will defeat Hitler.
Right, and Armchair Historian basically says that Stalin abandoned his principles in order to have this alliance with Britain, which just seems ridiculous. Like, why should, like, that seems to be something you would accuse him of, like, ideological puritanism for. If he said, no, I won't ally with Britain in this war against Germany, you would criticize him from the other side for doing the opposite. So it seems bizarre to say that it's bad for Stalin to talk about a united front of people standing for freedom when, I mean, Hitler is attacking non-socialist countries as well, and he's killing people not just for being socialist but for being, Jewish or whatever else. Opposing that doesn't seem in contradiction with socialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so here we can clearly say that Stalin's policies were worth it, and it didn't allow Hitler to portray the Soviet Union and Stalin as aggressors, as right threat. Again, I believe both Britain and the US would be very happy to side with Germany and divide the Soviet Union. They would be very happy to do so. We remember that it was the United States that had Ford in its ranks, and Hitler praised Ford. Actually, Hitler in general considered the US to be example, and there were some sources that said that Hitler wanted to turn Eastern Europe in basically German Wild West. And there are foundations to believe it would be so.
Right, and
While Hitler...
it could have been very likely that the U.S. did side with Germany. It just happened that FDR had other inclinations.
Hitler's early victories convinced him that he was a military genius. Stalin's early defeats shook him back to a semblance of reality. Though he continued ordering failed counteroffensives throughout 1941, he also reached out to other Allied powers and began essential negotiations for supplies and military aid. These diplomatic overtures would be Stalin's greatest contribution to the war.
And this is getting into something, a really interesting myth about, Hitler's kind of military genius or lack thereof versus Stalin's, and that each leader, Hitler and Stalin, both kind of tinkered with the military planning and things like this. And I think this is a great thing to get on to start talking about, because this is I think it's a good contrast between what did Hitler do and what was Hitler's impact on war planning versus what was Stalin's impact on war planning. And I think it's telling that the Armchair Historian doesn't mention Hitler's contribution to the war, because that would put Stalin's contribution in a much different light.
Mm-hmm. But before this, just listen, he also reached out to other Allied powers and began essential negotiations for supplies and military aid. These diplomatic overtures would be Stalin's greatest contribution to the war. So he just dismissed the entire industrialization, preparing the Red Army, transferring industry to the Urals, and said that the biggest thing that Stalin did throughout the war is asking allies. Really? Again, this person claimed that he will be debunking myths, that there are a lot of myths, and we can agree with this, but then he just keeps broadcasting like classic anti-Soviet narratives. This giant copium of the only thing Stalin did good is to ask allies to help him. No comments.
Right, and meanwhile, on the other side, he does mention that Hitler's early victories convinced him that he was a military genius. Well, we see in reality, whatever their personal self-conception, Hitler did actively intervene with military planning, and it was a disaster. His military, the Wehrmacht generals, were constantly complaining about Hitler's toying with military planning. And there's some books that talk about that Hitler actually majorly sabotaged the German war effort by splitting their focuses of the army and constantly having his own kind of ideological conceptions of why or how the war should be fought and where. This isn't being touched on at all, whereas Stalin's contributions to the war, or his getting personally involved in war planning, it isn't. It's not the same as Hitler's. And I think we can compare that Hitler was a political guy. He was a speaker and a writer, whereas Stalin, he was also a speaker and a writer, but Stalin actually had experience in military actions. He was a military officer in multiple campaigns in the Russian Civil War as well as other conflicts, and Stalin was involved in other conflicts like the war with Japan and things like this. So Stalin had this military experience that he brought into his contributions, his discussions that we would have with other top military generals. Not only did Stalin not, enforce his ideas and his opinions on his generals, but he actually had some educated opinions to give to those generals. And rather than just ordering them to carry out his opinions of what the war should be like Hitler did. Hitler was constantly letting his opinions affect German war planning.
Mm-hmm. And again, Armchair Historian went completely silent on the whole efforts of building strong industrial base, on creating army, and even making the Soviet Union capable of recovering from such a disastrous event as losing millions of soldiers, which actually took place in 1941. And somehow the USSR was able to create another army. Again, this went completely silent for Armchair Historian. He considers Stalin's great contribution to the war being the reaching out for other allied powers. I have to say some words about this Lend-Lease narrative, which is at least partially resembled in these words. The thing is that the Soviet Union produced about 90% of everything that was required for normal modern warfare by itself. Tanks, airplanes, aircraft, trucks, everything was produced in the USSR, and Lend-Lease played an essential role in some specific industries, and just helped in general. Like, they had tanks, Lend-Lease got USSR some more tanks. These efforts were more noticeable in aircraft, in navy, though there were few navy operations compared to land operations, obviously. Well, maybe one most significant thing that I can say about Lend-Lease is trucks. And even then, the majority of Lend-Lease supplies were in 1943, 1944, when the tide of war has already turned in favor of the Soviet Union. And when we speak about Lend-Lease, surely we know that it helped, it made some contribution, and the whole fact that capitalists supplied communists to defeat Nazis tells a lot. You know, they would not do it for free, but they had to do so. And this is achievement by itself. But however, saying that Lend-Lease won the war, or that the USSR had nothing, and reaching out to allies was the greatest contribution to the war by Stalin is just outright false.
Right, absolutely, and you're right that he is kind of directly implying without saying that Lend-Lease won the war, or rather that Lend-Lease cancels out the Stalinist Great Purge disaster of 1941 and 1942. He's saying as if Lend-Lease was able to balance out all those negatives from 1941-42, when, as you point out, Lend-Lease material really only started to arrive in significant amounts by like 1943, even late in 1943. So it's not it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And again, he's letting this mythology that we Americans learned in high school and in middle school, that America won World War II through Lend-Lease. Usually they focus on Britain, but it's the same, that Americans are told America won the war for everybody. And this is just kind of a continuation of that without really looking at the evidence and saying, Lend-Lease really had nothing to do with the Soviet Union's responses to invasion in 1941 and 42.
Mm-hmm. And if we return to 1941, Armchair Historian portrays it as if Stalin gave deliberately disastrous orders and therefore these counteroffensives failed. The issue is that the operations were affected by the general chaos of the German offensive and the retreat of the Red Army and the disruption of communications. And even then, we cannot say that these operations were a complete failure. For example, in the south, the pace of the German offensive was much lower because the troops of the Odessa military district carried out offensives that were quite successful. They even breached Romanian territory at some period. And, for example, the counteroffensive near Smolensk didn't allow Wehrmacht to repeat the French scenario and immediately rush to Moscow. Moreover, after having surrounded the troops of the Western Front near Vyazma, near Smolensk, Wehrmacht was forced to turn to Kiev, therefore losing their precious time and strategically losing Operation Barbarossa.
ensuring that the Red Army had the international backing necessary to absorb the horrific early losses inflicted by Operation Barbarossa.
Again, firstly, the Lend-Lease supplies were mostly after 1941, and the horrific early losses inflicted by Operation Barbarossa were about 95% of them were recovered thanks to the Soviet industry, which managed to produce enough equipment even when the industry was being transferred to the Urals. And in general, again, the author presents everything as if the Western allies were so kind, and as soon as Stalin turned to them, they immediately responded with consent. here again, the fact that the Soviet Union postponed the war until the very end played its role. The USSR had no reasons for war and didn't give any reasons for war, and therefore Hitler failed to convince the world that the Nazis were defending Europe from red menace.
Right, and it seems as if he set up this narrative with the earlier mention of the Urals, kind of saying that Stalin ordered the transfer of industry to the Urals as like a panicked hysteria, and that actually Lend-Lease was needed to fill the gap in industrial supplies that while there was that transfer going on. And I think, this is purely a mythology, like we are, as we already addressed, that if you're fighting on the front lines and you hear, you're going to get Lend-Lease materials sometime in the future, that doesn't help you repel the German operation now. So it's not really talking about the international support and Lend-Lease. That isn't really addressing what was happening on the ground on the front lines of Russia during 1942, for example. How were they able to resist at all? Clearly, there was more to the Soviet army and to the army leadership than what we've been told here.
Mm-hmm.
However, it should not be assumed that Stalin was the source of all military issues within the USSR. Even at his worst, he did listen to advice from his generals, and many supported his tactical decisions. Even Georgy Zhukov wrote in his memoirs, "We did not think that our armed forces would be such a failure at the start of the war and suffer such serious defeats in the first battles that they would be forced to retreat into the interior of the country. And at that time..."
And again, Armchair Historian invented a narrative about Stalin the individualist and then refuted it himself. Like, what was the point of even constructing this narrative then?
Right, and where was the evidence? He brought up this idea that Stalin was, this autocratic kind of leader commanding military reforms and operations. But why doesn't he make specific references to specific operations or specific actions by Stalin? Instead, we get the specific references are to things like Zhukov's memoirs, which are supporting Stalin's contributions, or Mikoyan's memoirs. Why aren't we getting actual sources on saying, Stalin, he gave notes on this and this operation, and that operation failed? No, he doesn't get into any specifics, and he remains at the level of generality.
Mm-hmm. Well, here he will continue speaking about the rest of the war. However, we will switch to the end of the video to give the summary on the majority of his video and on his conclusions. Again, for all newcomers who joined us recently, hello. Today we are covering the historical myths about whether the USSR was ready for war or not, because tomorrow we will have June 22nd, the day on which the Great Patriotic War started, and we thought that it would be a good chance to debunk classic anti-communist myth related to World War II.
The USSR presents a fascinating case study into a nation that entered the largest conflict in human history in perhaps the worst position possible.
So here, I want to say that Armchair Historian is forgetting that what the USSR actually got is not the worst case scenario. Firstly, let's remember about chemical weapons. Both Germany and the Soviet Union had huge stockpiles. However, none of them dared to use it. Secondly, the war could go on 2 or even 3 fronts for the Soviet Union. Let's not forget the war in the Far East, and again, it was a victory of Soviet diplomacy and Soviet army that Japan refused to declare war against the USSR when Germany was invading. Like, literally, Japan tried to invade Mongolia in 1939. The USSR destroyed Japanese forces in near Khalkhin Gol, and then the Nazi Germany signed non-aggression pact with the USSR, and Japan was,
Japan. He meant Japan.
yeah, and no, I meant that after Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Japan went furious. Japanese government had to explain how their ally signed a non-aggression pact with their direct enemy, and there was even some sort of catchphrase. They said something that European affairs are very complicated, and the distrust among the allies in the anti-Comintern Pact was so strong that Japan refused to do anything when Germany invaded Soviet Russia. Plus, they had their own conflict, which was the war with the United States, and therefore they were unable to do anything in the Far East. However, the danger of the threat of a potential war in the Far East was in place for almost 3 years. And throughout all of this time, the USSR had to have about 1 million men in the Far East. But it's not the only front. There was actually a third potential front, and it was Turkey. It's a known historical fact that when Germany was advancing to Stalingrad, Turkey had some secret negotiations on whether to open the front against the USSR in the Caucasus. And if Stalingrad would fall, there was a big chance that the USSR would be invaded by Turkey too. So combining this with the Far Eastern Front, this would mean that the USSR had to fight the war on 3 fronts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to mention the that Hitler was also always trying to develop. He created these puppet governments in the Caucasus region, especially like the Crimean Tatars and whoever else, who call themselves, because they were tied to Turkey, they call themselves the Crimean Turks. At least the ones that were especially aligned with Germany and Turkey, they called themselves Turks, and it was part of this broader Turkic nationalism. So yeah, Hitler was very attuned to the possibility of getting Turkey into the war, which luckily didn't end up happening. But there was a serious possibility of that front, especially with fascist Vichy French control of Syria and things like that, and the possibility of Iran. I believe Iran tried to join the Axis. So that front was not a non-issue. That was a serious front to consider.
Mm-hmm. Plus, many people like Armchair Historian forget that the Great Patriotic War was a war of an unimaginable scale for that period. Obviously, the Soviet people, the Soviet government knew that there would be a war with fascists, they were preparing for it, and that it would most likely will not be easy. But, well, obviously we all hope for the best, and they also hoped that this would be some sort of classic war with a declaration of war, with concentrating troops in one area. But it turned out to be across the entire space, from the Black Sea to the Baltics. Even in World War I, we had 4 nations fighting in such a space. And for example, now the so-called special military operation of Russia is underway. And although the border with Ukraine went from the Bryansk region to the Sea of Azov on February 24, 2022, we don't have clashes along its entire length. We have Donbass, we have Kursk border, and there are other parts of border, but they are mostly untouched. And back then, the entire space of Eastern Europe was one big giant front line. Well, obviously you can say, are they stupid? Why didn't they expect the worst? And here we can ask you another question. Do you expect a nuclear war to start now? Like, obviously you would hope for the best and even that we have conflicts like special military operation, like Israel and Iran. They are more or less normal, classic imperialist conflicts. But obviously, the nuclear war can start now too, and its chances are increasing right now.
Absolutely. And the idea that the Soviet Union was in the worst possible position at the start of the war is just a ridiculous claim. I mean, you could compare the situation for the Soviet Union to that of the Russian Empire at the end of World War I, or even the beginning of World War I. The Tsarist military was not doing very well, and in fact, the wartime experience of World War I was in a huge disaster for the Tsarist regime, and that's related to the February and October revolutions of 1917 are tied to that experience of the war. So it just doesn't seem like a real serious look at the history when the situation could be so much worse. You could have millions of people deserting from the army at a critical time, and he didn't. You could have a country that is industrially undeveloped and not ready to fight a modern war, and we see that the Soviet Union was. They did have the capability to fight a modern war. And yeah, to touch on Japan again, many people say that Stalin traitorously abandoned China, in order to have Molotov-Ribbentrop with Japan, when having a two-front war with Japan and Germany at the same time, that would be the worst possible situation. We can continually draw up, realistic situations that could have happened that would be so much worse. And in fact, the Soviet leadership and Stalin worked very hard to make sure that these worst situations did not come about. And yeah, so it just seems like a fait accompli. We're handed this conclusion that this is as bad as it could possibly be, when history shows a lot of very concerning situations.
Mm-hmm.
Ruled by a paranoid autocrat with practically no military experience, the Soviet Union paid a huge price during Operation Barbarossa and continued seeing defeats well into early 1943. But with each loss, the Red Army learned from its mistakes, methodically planning how to get the most use out of every individual soldier.
So, what myths were ultimately shattered? Because Armchair Historian just simply confirmed everything he allegedly opposed. Again, what he says.
Right, and he sets it up at the end as to kind of say, to reinforce a myth that he brought up at the very beginning about the human wave thing. And basically at this last line, he says, making the most use of every soldier. It's as if he's implying that they were going to be doing kamikaze attacks with these soldiers. And so this castle in the sky that he's constructing gets, there's no undermining it. It gets to maintain its place, and this myth is completely enshrined. There's no challenging to the myths, even though he kind of presented the very beginning of the video as one in which he would debunk these myths. But we've come to the end.
Mm-hmm. Again,
paranoid autocrat with practically no military experience.
The thing is that Stalin actually had military experience during the Russian Civil War. Plus, his role in the Great Patriotic War too.
The Soviet Union paid a huge price during Operation Barbarossa and continued seeing defeats well into early 1943.
It's unclear because he's saying it in such a one-sided way that it leaves an impression that the USSR was only losing till early 1943. And, he's silent about the fact that Operation Barbarossa actually failed. Like, it ended with the Red Army driving Germans out of outskirts of Moscow. And it was the first major defeat for Germany through the entire World War II. It happened in 1941 under Moscow.
And we can compare this thing about Stalin not having any military experience to their neighbors to the left and right. I mean, on the Western side, you have the Adolf Hitler, who certainly had no military. Well, he had the most meager of military experience as like a private message runner in World War One. And on the opposite side, on the Eastern side, you have Japan, which was run by a military dictatorship. The actual generals and admirals of the Army and Navy were the ones running the government. So you have the most military experience possible leading the government on the Japanese side, and they still lost, and they made embarrassing military decisions. So this idea that Stalin looks poor in comparison to his peers, or that he had this outsized negative impact because he's so paranoid and inexperienced. I mean, you can compare him to other examples, and it doesn't hold up very well.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But with each loss, the Red Army learned from its mistakes, methodically planning how to get the most use out of every individual soldier. Stalin also learned to trust his military commanders to do their job without micromanagement, something his Nazi counterpart never grasped. The Red Army went from a state of near anarchy at the start of the conflict to inflicting the overwhelming majority of German casualties and swiftly invading Japanese Manchuria in only 10 days.
Yeah, and
he
go on.
Pardon me, thank you. But he learned to trust his commanders. He's a grown man. It seems odd that he would be learning so late in life in such a crisis situation that he would suddenly be learning. I think the reality would suggest that this is something that he was inclined to do already, that he understood the role of these military officers and commanders in the wartime process of planning and everything. It seems ridiculous to claim that, his whole attitude reversed over the course of the war. And I think it's presenting there's this myth, and the myth is kind of challenged by history. So he has to say that, the myth is still true, but Stalin, he learned to be better. He's everything that the myth says, but he learned over the course of the war somehow.
Mm-hmm. Plus, adding to the story about the Civil War, and this is actually a fact that was highlighted by Stalin in his speeches throughout the war, and even in his legendary November 7, 1941 parade speech, he emphasized that yes, we have serious problems ahead, but remember 1918, when we had no army, when we had no industry, and now we have industry, we have army, we have the entire Soviet people united, and therefore this war would be easier than it was back in the Russian Civil War. And if we speak about this transition, as Armchair Historian calls it, from a state of near anarchy to inflicting the overwhelming majority of German casualties, we have to ask a question: how did it happen? What was the reason that France, for example, could not do the same? And the communists managed to create basically a second army to replace the lost one. How did it happen? And Hitler, for example, couldn't do the same when the war reached the German territory. Why did the communists succeed? And here the answer is that socialism was able to create a system capable of withstanding even such defeats. It was thanks to socialism, to the socialist system, that the USSR made a major contribution to this war and ultimately won it. But again, the Armchair Historian is in no hurry to admit it, because otherwise it might turn out that Stalin was good, and so the communists were good in general. And this is something that neither Armchair Historian nor average bourgeois historians want to admit.
Absolutely, because then a review of that kind of information would make it seem that like socialism itself and the ideals of communism were actually constructive and progressive in terms of building a modern industrial society that would be capable of defeating such an immense challenge. It's that conclusion is almost there. It's almost within reach for them, but they intentionally, yes, don't seem to want to touch on the political and social factors that make this kind of industrial development possible, that make this kind of recruitment, the social forces of keeping people from deserting, keeping people fighting for this cause and giving them the arms and the equipment to do so. They don't want to touch on how that was possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then here come the credits. So, do you have to say anything regarding this video in general?
I mean, I think it's a very interesting video, or I think it's a good encapsulation of the modern place where historians are and where bourgeois historiography is at right now, where they're starting to address the existence of some of these myths. I mean, he touches on the fact that in single sentence statements, he touches on each of these problems, but then he retreats back into the standard position. So I think we can see how modern historiography has kind of led to the creation of these narratives. And I think I said this at the beginning as well, that these myths and this bourgeois historiography has huge implications for modern socialists and the modern socialist movement and our ability to talk to people about genuine socialism and genuine socialist ideals. They are being coached to oppose everything that has to do with the Soviet Union, and so these stories about World War II have a central place in keeping modern politics backwards and keeping modern people from exploring kind of genuine socialist answers to the problems of modern society.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that a lot of information that he voiced is very simple anti-communist, anti-Soviet propaganda that was largely promoted in the former Soviet republics back in 1990s, in early 2000s, and I would say that most of it, the majority of information that I told you, is from Russian books on this topic. Unfortunately, I haven't managed to find anything like this in English, so, well, I think maybe we will compile a list of potential books available in Russian that you could access and maybe translate them in English, or, for example, they are on websites and you could translate them with browsers like Google Chrome to get information about them. The important thing is that Western historical books are largely relying on untrusted sources, on biased information, and therefore their narrative about the Great Patriotic War is almost always with bad image. Stalin is bad, everything is bad, it's just somehow they managed to win, and very often they say that the victory was possible thanks to Lend-Lease. Again, Armchair Historian claiming to debunk myths and then just saying that the biggest contribution of Stalin was reaching out to Western allies is just no comments.
And touching on those Russian sources that you mentioned, modern historical books that are published, especially in the U.S. and the West, where they're very allergic to modern sources coming out of Russia or modern interpretations. I often see them citing these books from 1993, from the 90s, late 80s to the early 2000s, relying on a very narrow set of sources. Like the Mikoyan book. Well, why do they have to rely on this one book over and over and over again, and we see it repeated, instead of looking at more modern historical reviews? Because a lot of the more modern histories, I mean, even the ones coming out of bourgeois history, are debunking some of these myths over time. And maybe they'll debunk one at a time. You know, one myth is undermined here or there, but then you'll see in these, kind of general history books that kind of discuss the overview of Soviet history, they rely on certain books from especially the 90s and late 80s. And they are afraid they can't withstand more intense view or different sources. And when you look at those sources from the 90s, they're fairly weak. So there's a lot of Russian history and a lot of more current history even being published in the West that isn't getting it's as if they've ignored that these historical studies are being done, and they're kind of defaulting back to something 30 years ago. Some of these sources that they're relying on over 30 years old now, and they're afraid to update that because that would challenge a lot of these myths that are apparently very important to the historical narrative that they want to paint, that they can't let go of these early 90s sources.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope that the information that we told you will be useful in your conversations, especially in your historical debates with various liberals who like to promote the same false narratives that Armchair Historian is spreading in his video. Well, I think the stream is over for today. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Again, we hope that the information that we provided will be useful for you. And don't forget to click the bell button to join us on another similar stream. Again, thank you for joining in today, and see you next stream. Goodbye, comrades.